Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. This is Volts for September 11th, 2024. This new organization wants to remake PUCs for the energy transition. I'm your host, David Roberts. One of the most important institutions in the energy transition is, perversely, one of the least scrutinized and cross-pressured. I am speaking, of course, about the Public Utility Commission, or PUC. As Volts listeners know, power utilities are monopolies. They have sole access to customers or distribution infrastructure in a particular service area. But they are not unrestrained, unregulated monopolies. To the contrary, each one is quite heavily regulated. In each of the 50 states, there is a PUC, the job of which is to tell utilities what they can and can't do with rates, programs, and investments. PUCs have direct regulatory authority over the entities at the heart of the U.S. electricity system, which is itself the heart of the U.S. clean energy future. That gives them immense power and significance. Yet, most of their work goes on in obscurity, with only utility lawyers and lobbyists paying attention. Neither the public nor most clean energy advocates pay much attention to who is appointed or elected to PUCs. Very few activists show up at PUC meetings. Legislatures face very little pressure to write better rules for their PUCs. Charles Hua wants to change all that. An energy analyst who has worked at Rewiring America, DOE's Loans Programs Office, and now at the Berkeley Lab as a research affiliate, Hua has taken note of the centrality but obscurity of PUCs and decided to do something about it. He is starting a nonprofit organization called PowerLines, meant to pull together a big tent coalition of people interested in PUC reform. Everyone from PUC staffers themselves to state legislators, clean energy providers and customers, academics and researchers, and grassroots groups. He wants people paying attention and getting involved in this long-neglected area. The official mission statement: PowerLines aims to modernize the utility regulatory system to accelerate affordable, reliable, and clean energy for American consumers. I could not be more supportive of this mission, and I could not be more honored that Hua has chosen to publicly unveil the effort on Volts. I can't wait to talk to him about it. With no further ado, Charles Hua, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
David, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
I'm so geeked about this. I've been geeked about this for a long time, ever since we first talked about it. This is one of those ideas that I just feel like, the time has come. I'm really excited to walk through it. So, I said in the intro, PUCs, there's one in every state. Their job is to regulate utilities. Maybe let's just talk a little bit to begin with for, 2 or 3 minutes, just about what do they do kind of on a day-to-day basis? What does it mean that PUCs regulate utilities?
Sure. So, first, we're spending an hour talking about PUCs because they're the most important, yet at least understood body in energy. I like to call them the guardians of the energy transition. So what do? Well, they regulate all kinds of utilities: electricity, gas, telecoms, water, in some cases, rail and transportation as well. They usually regulate the investor-owned utilities in the state, although sometimes they regulate the munis and rural electric co-ops. And broadly speaking, they're in charge of 3 really important things. One is how much people pay for energy. 2 is how much utilities invest in different forms of energy. And then 3rd is where certain energy and transmission projects are located. They can play other roles as well. They participate in regional transmission organizations. They coordinate with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they implement federal and state policies like the Inflation Reduction Act and renewable portfolio standards. So they're really, really powerful. In fact, These 200 people oversee over $200 billion in annual utility spending. That's $1 billion a person, yet few people know who their state's PUC commissioners are or what they do. And we should be talking about them like they're Supreme Court justices in terms of their impact on energy and equity issues.
It is a little crazy how much people in our world complain about utilities. And here I am very much looking in the mirror. And how little they complain about PUCs. But as you say, like utilities can't really do anything without PUC permission. Like almost nothing. Like they can't raise rates. They can't spend substantial amounts of money. They can't permit large projects. Like all of it goes through this regulatory body. And yet, as you say, it's bizarre. There's like, they almost never come up in conversation. Like I bet not one person out of 1,000 could tell you the name of a single person on their state's PUC.
That's generous.
It is crazy. So these are significant bodies. Let's talk just a little bit about why they are falling short. Why aren't they doing a better job? I mean, I think we can agree. I think most people in our world who are aware of them have their complaints about them, feel like regulation is too lax, that they defer to utilities too easily, et cetera. So maybe let's just run through some of the factors that make it difficult for PUCs to do their jobs well.
Sure. And just to frame things before we talk about why PUCs aren't able to fully meet the moment under the current system that we have, let me just start and explain kind of the context behind the moment that we're in. So we haven't had to think about electricity and utility regulation, in part because for a while, our grid was functioning fine. It wasn't perfect, but we didn't have to care that much about our energy bills in most instances. And in general, the grid was resilient. But things are changing really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, utilities, you should say like 5-10 years ago, it was difficult to get people in our world to even pay attention to utilities. So, we're making progress here, I guess.
That's right. And there's, a couple reasons why utilities have become more salient. Not great reasons, but electricity rates are skyrocketing.
Yeah.
They've grown 20% since the start of 22. The grid is becoming increasingly fragile. There's a preponderance of extreme weather events like wildfires, hurricanes, winter storms, Uri, Elliott, they all point to that. And then there's this new trend, this growing electricity demand driven by AI and manufacturing that's creating even more strains on an already challenged grid. So all these different stakeholders, they're not getting what they want, including the utilities, who feel that consumer trust is at an all-time low, including the commercial and industrial customers with clean energy targets that aren't getting clean electricity fast enough, and certainly low-income communities that have always had to pay a disproportionate share of their income and their wealth on energy and continue to face shutoffs. So we've been living under this illusion of stability, but in reality, we're coming close to reaching a breaking point if we don't pay attention and we don't act now.
Well, we should just add to all that, because I noticed you mentioned, grid stress from weather, burgeoning demand from AI, et cetera. But also, P.S., we're trying to transition the entire material basis of our electricity system underneath us without any loss of service, even as we meet these challenges.
Well, that's certainly true.
Just to throw that in there too.
So to get at your question, why are PUCs not structured in such a way to meet this current moment? Well, there are 3 reasons in particular that I point to regarding the underperforming state of utility regulation today. First is that the job is fundamentally very hard. Important to add some nuance to the notion of what it means to be a regulator and just how hard the job is. You might need to review a rate case every year, an IP every 2 years, an integrated resource plan, I should say, every 2 years. Maybe the state passed a new clean electricity law, so you now have to figure out how to align utility regulation with those objectives. You have to participate in several RTO meetings. You have electric and gas utilities, and you have to manage the energy transition and electrification in an affordable way. There's thousands of pages of dockets to get through. You got to engage with FERC.
You have to figure out if utilities are being above board about all of this.
Exactly.
Even though they have way more information than you do. You're sort of like scrabbling to put together a picture of what's going on with insufficient information.
Exactly. And if you think about, when you're doing a good job, nobody's really thanking you, and
Yes.
that the lights, are turning on and
Yes.
rates are low. But when you're doing a bad job, when the lights go off, everybody's calling for your head. And it's a hard job, and I think that's really important to acknowledge. But that leads into the second point and the second reason why PUCs are underperforming today, and that's because there's a human capital problem here, where PUCs are understaffed, they're under-resourced, they're underappreciated, they're not prestigious, and that's not right, because we need to build a robust, talented, passionate pipeline of folks engaged in these issues. Yet what we're seeing right now in the ground is that there's a lot of turnover at commissions. Any given year, a quarter of the commissioners may be exiting. The average tenure of a PUC commissioner is roughly 4 to 5 years. So by the time a PUC commissioner knows where the bathroom hallway is, they're gone. And they don't have that kind of public recognition or gratitude to lean on. So how can we expect PUCs to take a step back, think systemically, and realize that we're not meeting this moment?
Yeah, it's not really it's such a good point. It's not really a prestige job. It's not really something that like a, a sort of ambitious young person, whatever, coming out of a good school wants to play in the energy transition, wants to do something good. On the merits, this is such a great place for that kind of person to be. They have their hands on all kinds of things, but there's no acknowledgement of that. There's no celebration of that. There's no sort of like channel pushing people toward that. And, you often see sort of governors making appointments to these things. You can kind of see from their appointments that the governors also don't necessarily acknowledge how important their PUCs are. They're often treated as like ambassadorships or something like that. You know what I mean? Sort of like give it to someone as a kind of an emeritus, credential, but not necessarily someone who's good for the job. So they're neglected not only by the public, but also, I think you're right, even by professionals in this field and even by the kind of governments around them.
Right. And that's a problem. To your point, like oftentimes these roles are the capstones for former legislators or governors' staffers in their careers. And it's kind of an endpoint. And the incentives for those situations aren't aligned such that they're trying to be ambitious and bold in enacting new reforms and advancing policies. And that's a lead into kind of the last point that I would call out in terms of why PUCs are underperforming. And that's that, and you alluded to this earlier, people are not paying attention to this stuff. You yourself have described utility regulation as a force field of tedium. It's a brilliant phrase. Nobody wants to pay attention to it because it's super unsexy. But that's exactly how the public interest gets lost in this whole mix, is when people don't pay attention, when there isn't the disinfectant of sunlight. And when legislators' constituents don't, call up their legislators to let them know about these issues and the power that legislators have, the actors in this system don't feel a broader sense of accountability because people aren't paying attention. And so that's why raising awareness of the importance of PUCs is actually a key solution. It's not just raising awareness for raising awareness' sake.
Right.
It's actually raising awareness so that we can build our collective intelligence around what's at stake and the need for all of us to come together to be informed and to figure out the best path forward so that we can all confront the real trade-offs and balances that we need to make.
Yeah, I mean, you don't mention this maybe because you're trying to be nice, but there are some people who pay attention, very close attention to what goes on at PUCs, namely the utilities whose profits are on the line, right? And so
that's true.
Because no one else is paying attention and only utilities are paying attention, generally utilities get what they want. I mean, I think it's a fair generalization to say that in general, utilities get what they want out of their PUCs. And another thing you didn't mention is that this job is often a way station for people who are either coming from or going back to utilities. So there's a revolving door here too. And if you know that you're going to go back to a utility in a few years, obviously you're pretty incentivized not to upset the utility.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why shining a spotlight and raising awareness around this matters and does have a material impact, because not only does it combat the situations where there's an actual, malintention, which is to kind of engage in that revolving door, let's say, but also in cases where folks are trying their hardest to do a good job, to be proactive, they need to feel support.
Presumably some of these 200 people are there for the right reasons and public-spirited and want to do a good job. What would they say in their own defense, I guess? If, as we're criticizing PUCs, like what would they say about why they're not able to do a better job?
Well, I think it is these three things that I pointed to. It's that the job is really hard. There's, structural constraints in terms of the resources that they have available, and that the public isn't paying attention. And, just to put a finer point on that, like just how hard the talent recruitment and retention piece is. If you're a very well-meaning public service commissioner, and there are, a good number of them out there, if your staffer, if your top advisor is being paid $60,000 a year, and you have some of the most difficult, work in this whole space, your role is just as critical to a well-functioning grid as the utilities.
Yeah.
But there are these fundamental constraints that I want to acknowledge, because I do firmly believe that the majority of public utility commissioners in this country, they are making a sacrifice to serve in that role, but we need to make sure that we still pay attention to them to make sure that they're empowered and also have a broader sense of accountability to the public interest when they're regulating the utilities.
Right. We're back to state capacity, a regular theme here on Volts. Before we get to some specifics, though, just as a general matter, like you sent me this paper that was co-authored by Alexandra Klaas, I'm not sure how to say her last name, but part of the argument she's making is that PUCs aren't quite as constrained as they say they are. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that argument. Like, are these commissioners more gun shy than they need to be by the letter of the law?
I do think so. And there are a couple reasons for that. So, to provide a little bit more historical context for listeners, I'm sure some of whom are already aware of the intimate history around why we set up PUCs. But, in the 20th century, we determined that electric and gas utilities and these other utilities should be natural monopolies because that was the most efficient way of building the infrastructure that we need. And so in return, in exchange for that state-granted monopoly status, there was a need to create a really strong regulatory enforcement mechanism.
Right. And it's worth saying the reason there was that need is that America had recent experience with unregulated monopolies in the form of like railroads, and they sort of became legendarily corrupt and powerful. So this was actually like this whole system we have of PUCs watching over utilities is kind of it originated in reformist sort of thinking.
Yes, that's right. It's birthed from this notion of advancing and protecting the consumer and public interest.
Right.
So the statutory and legal authority given to these PUCs was determined in that time where, there were both state and federal efforts to define the duties and responsibilities of these PUCs to advance the public interest. And, over the course of the 20th century, that really centered on three things: affordability, reliability, and safety. But, as you and your listeners certainly know, we don't live in a paradigm of the 20th century anymore. We have all these other challenges, be it these extreme weather events, be it the need to decarbonize our electricity system and do it in a way that reduces energy burdens and advances environmental justice outcomes for the communities that have been left behind and underinvested in. There are these pressures, but our regulatory system has not kept pace. In other words, we haven't taken that systematic approach of figuring out what are the additions to the legal authorities of these commissions that we need to have so that these PUCs are well equipped to regulate and make decisions in a modern paradigm.
So you think kind of the original language about public interest is broad enough that there's room within it to add more, basically, to add climate and justice and things like that.
Exactly. And that is the argument that Professor Alex Klass and others have made, which is that there's still a big gap between what PUCs think they can do and what they can actually do. And so we need to make sure that every PUC and every PUC commissioner is aware of that gap and knows what else they could be doing. And there is a need for more bold, courageous, proactive leadership and forward thinking to advance a lot of utility regulatory modernization measures that we're talking about. And the way to combat that, and the way, I think it's important to acknowledge the context behind why they're underperforming around the lack of prestige, the lack of resources, the lack of public awareness, is because if we have those pieces in place, then it becomes a lot more achievable for these commissions and commissioners to be doing exactly what they need to be doing, to be playing offense and not calling balls and strikes.
Right. And I also think, maybe this is like, you have to be careful talking about this because you don't want to, I don't want to condescend to PUC commissioners who probably know a lot more about PUCs than I do, but I don't think we should assume that just because someone gets appointed to a PUC that they necessarily thereby understand the history and establishing legal language and the limits and all these kind of things. So just like educating the people on the PUCs about their range of motion, I feel like should be a piece of this, but.
That's right. And talking about them like they're Supreme Court justices and emphasizing the power that they have, I think is a good reminder because you're right. A lot of people aren't aware of the power that they wield.
Right. Okay, so we'll get back to PowerLines, this new organization, in a little bit. But setting that aside for now, let's just talk about, if I'm a concerned citizen, say I'm, a renewable energy developer or a big company, something, and I hear you about PUCs and I say, okay, Charles, I get it. PUCs are super important. They need reform. Here I am, an interested party. How should I think about approaching PUCs? How can I focus on PUCs? You have these three sort of pillars to help kind of focus attention and efforts. Let's walk through those.
Sure. So you can call it the 3 Ps, but it's 3 things that are really important to focus on.
Every cool area of policy needs its own 3 Ps, I feel like.
That's right. So the 3 Ps of utility regulation are people, policy, and process. So let's break that down. What do each of these pieces mean? So in terms of people, you have these 200 PUC commissioners serving these seats, but it's not just the commissioners, of course. It's the governors that appoint them in the 40 states. It's the electorate that elects them in the 10 states across the Southeast and the Southwest.
So wait, let me just clarify that. 40 states, governors appoint PUC commissioners. 10 states, they are elected.
Yes, and I should add a little bit of clarification. So in 2 of those 40 states, it's technically the legislature that appoints them. So that's South Carolina and Virginia, where the legislature appoints the PUC.
Huh. Okay. But in 10 states, they're elected. So, if nothing else, voters in those states could clue in.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, to that point, we need to pay more attention to these opportunities to appoint and elect commissioners that are really committed to advancing the public interest. So I think we'll touch on that a little bit more. But so you have these 200 commissioners, and we need to figure out how to support them to do their job effectively and advance the right outcomes. So providing the resources that they need, making sure that the public is engaged, making sure that the voices of residents and low-income ratepayers in particular are elevated and amplified in these processes. But, we talked a little bit about this. It's also the staff, right? So these are some of the most important jobs in the energy transition. And think about it. Nobody goes to a job in government because it's well-paying. They do it because it's an opportunity for them to serve their country and to have significant impact that's aligned with some mission. People work at the White House and Congress and DOE in part because it is prestigious. So again, we need to make these roles more prestigious and talk about them. But it is important that we have the best and brightest folks working in this space.
And I'm guessing that the average governor, when he or she is contemplating an appointment to a PUC, is not hearing a lot from the public about is not hearing from anyone really about what they want in that appointment.
That's right. So, I've I've made it a little bit of a personal duty anytime I'm fortunate enough to be in the presence of a governor to ask them, hey, how do you think about your PUC appointments? I'm sure they get that question on the daily. But, I think it's important that they hear from you, because if they don't, then it's sort of whoever the loudest voice, which, typically is correlated with money and power.
Yep.
Influences that pick. So they do need to hear from you and know that your input actually matters.
Is there a success story you could...
There are.
Like, in terms of this, like, does pressure work? Does this work?
I think so. Absolutely. There aren't a whole lot of examples because I don't think that these sort of efforts have been deployed to their fullest extent.
Yeah.
But, there are instances in Pennsylvania, to some degree North Carolina, where a lot of groups got together and advocated for their respective governors to appoint folks that were really committed to advancing the public interest. Now, there are some constraints in those states. The legislatures weren't supportive, so there were threats to yank certain commissioners from the mix. But we need to deploy this strategy systematically. That's the key, is that, again, these are Supreme Court justices. We need to proactively understand how we can get the best folks, the best and brightest and most committed to advancing the public interest folks onto these commissions.
All right. So that's the first pillar and the most straightforward and kind of obvious. Like, people or policy. People is, especially in DC, especially in politics, like, people are everything. So just paying more attention to who gets appointed or who gets elected is obviously step one.
That's right. So the second pillar is policy. What does this mean? So we need to pay attention to the policy frameworks that shape how all of this works. So I talked a little bit about it earlier, which is this notion of, the legal authority of PUCs and updating them. Who updates them? Well, and who, determines the utility regulatory system? Well, if you go back to that history, a key actor in all of this and setting up the utility regulatory system that we have today is state legislators and state legislatures. They oftentimes aren't aware of the power that they have over all of this, because when you think utility regulation, you think of the utilities and you think of the regulators. Nowhere in that statement is the legislators, but they actually create the rules of the game for what the regulators need to do and what the utilities can do. So,
right, like, one thing you often hear from PUC commissioners is, hey, I'm just a technocrat. I'm just here implementing what the legislature told me. Don't look at me, look at the legislature. Probably not.
That's right.
Totally fair, but it is true that the legislature should be in the mix here.
Yes, and that's a portion of it. And in other cases, you'll hear from a commissioner saying, well, we're afraid of getting sued if we're perceived to overstep our authority, or if the law doesn't say we can do this, or it's not in our job description, or we're already stretched thin as a commission as it is. We can't, attach all these other analyses around environmental justice or around resilience, because we have to figure out how we can, advance and identify the least cost portfolio of generation and distribution resources. So there are these, other things, but the key solution here is for state legislators and other policymakers to pass legislation that ultimately revises the authorities that the commissions have. So to give you a very specific example, now the majority of Americans live in a state with 100% clean energy target or standard. But not all of these states actually give their PUCs authority to embed decarbonization and equity in all of their decision making.
Oh, interesting.
That's an opportunity. So, only about a dozen states have actually given their PUC that authority around decarbonization, and roughly half as many around environmental justice.
And that's just as simple as saying that in addition to reliability and cost and safety, also consider decarbonization and justice. I mean, that's
right.
The revision.
That's exactly right. And so there are tweaks like that, simple tweaks, which are in some sense no-brainers for those states that have those targets. And in theory, you're not going to encounter opposition if you already have a policy in place that says that the state needs to go in that direction.
Right.
So, for instance, not every state with a 100% clean electricity standard actually directs the PUC to implement that standard or make decisions aligned with the law. So there are, some instances where the PUC can make decisions that are actually misaligned with the state's broader goals.
Right, because it's not necessarily true that decarbonization is going to be in every 2-year rate period the lowest cost, right?
Yes.
So it could be that like utilities trying to implement the law run afoul of their PUCs.
Yes, that's right. So there are surgical tweaks to the legal authority that we really need to examine and make. And these state legislators really can and should regulate the regulators, and they need to hear from you. They need to hear from you to understand that they have that power and authority and that they're not, somehow passive bystanders
Right.
to how this entire system works.
All right. And let's also shout out Colorado. Another good approach legislators could take here is what they did in Colorado, which is to make it illegal for utilities to use ratepayer money to lobby legislatures, which seems so obvious to me. Like it's a monopoly. Of course, it should not also be lobbying the legislature. It's crazy. And it certainly should not be using people's own money to lobby against their interests. Like it's just insane. Like Colorado has made that illegal. And I think 1 or 2 other states.
There have been a couple other states that have advanced that policy. That's right.
That seems like a no-brainer to me. In your papers, you cite Hawaii, which passed this sort of performance-based regulation. So like one of the big problems, and surely every Volts listener has heard me complain about this at least once by now. But right now, investor-owned utilities make money by spending money. They get a rate of return on investment, which just incentivizes investment, regardless of its quality or its relationship to decarbonization, and it discourages anything that would economize or implement efficiencies or have them use less power or build less, which is like half the stuff we want to do now. So that's a terrible incentive structure, as I've said a million times. So one alternative that some states are exploring is called PBR, or performance-based regulation, which just says some version of utilities should make money based on performance.
Yes.
Based on doing a good job. A crazy notion in the utility world. They should make money based on how well they do the job. And of course, different states will have different metrics, how they define good job. But my question, the whole preamble of that is, my question is that one of those things where PUCs feel like we have to be told by a legislature to do that if you want us to do that? Or is that the kind of thing where a PUC could just do it on its own because it seems to serve the public interest best?
I think that there's probably a really in-depth legal analysis across all 50 states that is necessary there. But I think in practice, though, usually it's the former, where it is a pretty radical departure from our current notion of regulation, which is known as cost of service regulation, as you point out.
Right.
And, I think there is an important nuance here where there's this notion that you need PBR to have the right incentives, but it's important to call out that all regulation is incentive regulation. And what does that mean? That means that under any framework that you use across that spectrum, from the traditional ways that we regulate utilities to the most innovative kind of performance-based ways, is that you are going to incentivize utilities to do X or Y if you're the regulator, because they have to listen to you, which you point out.
Right. You're creating some sort of incentive no matter what you do.
Right. So if you're the PUC and you tell, the utilities, hey, you have to do X, Y, Z, you don't necessarily need to create a metric for them to do it. Now, in some states, PBR makes sense as a solution. It doesn't necessarily make sense across the board, and could certainly devote a whole episode to diving into that.
Yes, I will someday.
And reasonable people disagree on how effective of a mechanism that is, in part because that is such a big policy departure, and the timescales are such that, utilities are fine with changing the ways that they're compensated in the medium and long term, perhaps. Because as long as they can, if they can make the same amount of money, right. That's fine. But the problem is to get to that sort of ideal PBR end state, that's not necessarily going to be great for the financial performance of the utilities in the short term. And so there's going to be a lot of resistance to that policy. So I want to add a little bit of nuance to this notion that we can just suddenly get to performance-based regulation overnight, because it is really complex. And I think that's where having the attention to people, policy, and process that we talk about matters. Because if we have stakeholders with a vested interest in this specific policy engaged, then that's going to be important.
You're teeing me right up here. It's just to make mention of the fact that I interviewed on the pod Marissa Gillette, who is the head of the PUC in Connecticut, who is attempting to implement something like performance-based regulation and is getting all kinds of blowback from utilities. They're losing their minds trying to get her fired, lobbying the governor to get her out of there because she's trying to reform things. So this thing, I think this goes to illustrate everything we've said so far. A, it's important to have the right people, right? Because she's a ass kicker, and if she wasn't, she would have been steamrolled by now. And two, policy matters. It matters that the governor is engaged and aware of the importance of this. It matters that these stories get some public exposure and that the public is at least somewhat aware of what's going on. Like, all of that is playing out in Connecticut right now.
That's right. So just to close out the three pillars, the third is process. And this also really matters because public utility commissions have the word public in their name. We forget that sometimes, but it's crucial that the public shows up and is engaged. And more public engagement is critical because it not only gives the regulators more information and context behind what communities and people are facing around high, energy burdens and high energy bills or environmental injustice issues, but it also empowers them and actually gives them more authority to act in the public interest when there is demonstrable evidence that they can point to from the public in these decisions. So it's critical to have, the public engaged, and it also makes sure that utilities can better understand how to proactively incorporate the public interest into their own decisions when they're attempting to do so. But right now, because there isn't a ton of public engagement relative to just how important these bodies are, we need to elevate that.
So that's just as simple as making it easier to attend meetings. What are some of the sort of tangible things?
Yeah. Great question. So FERC has a good model for this. So they've created an Office of Public Participation that has really tried to demystify wholesale markets and all our favorite juicy energy regulatory stuff. But it's also things, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about this in a little bit, which is intervener compensation. So providing advocates and community groups and ratepayer groups with the funding to be able to participate in PUC proceedings.
This is so important.
And it's also things that you don't necessarily think about, but like having an accessible website that's not from, the 90s.
Anyone involved in utility world is absolutely sitting up in their chair right now.
Absolutely.
We've all seen the 90s websites.
Yes. But it's, it's also things like the PUCs usually meet in the capitals of states. But if you're talking about big states, there's an opportunity for PUC commissioners and commissions to hold meetings elsewhere so that they actually do hear from the rest of the public. And it's things like not having meetings just Tuesdays at 10 a.m., which really ensure that only the people who actually have day jobs working in utility regulation show up when we want a broader public engagement.
What about, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what about the other side of the process agita, which is this notion these days that everything takes too friggin' long in the US and there's too much process everywhere you look, and that by adding more process to PUC proceedings, you're just going to do to PUCs what's been done to everyone else, which is make it very slow and impossible to really do anything. How do you think about that balance?
It's a really good question. What I'm not picturing here, to be clear, is this notion that, we have a bunch of people that are showing up and saying things that are not aligned with the public interest.
A bunch of old people show up at the urban planning meetings.
Well, look, people have opinions, and it's we do live in a society, and there are people with differing views. But what we're really talking about here is that just take something as simple as affordability and reliability. Like almost every state, including in recent memory, is struggling with one or two, if not both of those. And certainly if you're talking about clean energy and environmental justice impacts. But these commissioners need to hear from you to understand that, just approving a rate hike, even approving a portion of a rate hike, is not tenable for XYZ reason. And so, you're right. Process can be very long to engage. Like sometimes, you go through all this stuff with an integrated resource plan only, for the PUC to not actually formally approve or reject the IRP because they don't have the authority to do that. So in some cases, we do need to take a strict look at where can we streamline some processes to make them better. And then in other instances, and maybe where do we need to kind of expand our conception of what that process should look like. So there is a balance. And with this whole effort around modernizing utility regulation, it's not so much more regulation or less regulation. Right. It's smarter and better and more effective regulation.
Okay, so those are the kind of the three pillars, the three ways to think about how to approach PUC reform. There's the people, there's the policy that governs these things, and then there's just the literal day-to-day nuts and bolts processes by which they make decisions and have meetings, et cetera. All of those are in need of reform. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of your policy ideas and policy foci. But maybe before that, I'm just sort of like curious, like, surely you're not the first to do this. You're not the first to pay attention to PUCs. Like, I feel like I'm sure there are some portion of listeners who are out there tearing their hairs out saying, I've been beating my head against this wall for 10 years. Welcome, newbies. So maybe let's talk just a little bit about, like, what have we tried? What sort of like other efforts are there that you've heard of along these lines? What have we tried, and do we know anything about kind of what works when people do pay attention and get engaged? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts. People using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. What sort of like other efforts are there that you've heard of along these lines? What have we tried, and do we know anything about kind of what works when people do pay attention and get engaged?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I do want to really underscore just how, I think, grateful as the public we need to be about all of the advocates that have really been in the trenches and engaged in PUC proceedings and dockets in the past, because, certainly ratepayer advocates, a lot of the time, they're doing the public's work. But again, the public may not even know that there's a ratepayer advocate or they don't even know that there's a PUC. So they don't know that there's a ratepayer advocate at the PUC. If I had to characterize the sort of modes of engagement in the past, it's largely been formal intervention in formal PUC proceedings around rate cases, integrated resource plans, and other key dockets.
Right, so submitting comments via the official sort of comment submission process.
Yes, that's right. And I think that that's been really effective. It certainly hasn't, I think, fully advanced the public interest. That's why we're having this conversation. But those efforts have been really important. And I think what we're suggesting is that we need to further our investment in those efforts and also take new approaches. So, but maybe let me just kind of explain a little bit what my sense and diagnosis is of why some of these efforts, why we haven't been able to crack this nut. And I think fundamentally, I would point to maybe a couple things. So first, I would say that we've been largely treating this as a technical issue and not as a issue around people's energy bills, their health, their comfort. I would argue that this is the most personal part of energy and climate and other issues is your energy bill.
Yeah.
And so we've been leaving the public out, but I think that actually needs to change, and we need to have more public engagement.
Well, and I think also maybe like the people involved might have said, like, easy to say, but try 5 years ago to like get the public interested in PUCs.
Yes.
I think maybe like the time is right now for the public to engage in a way that maybe has not been true until now.
That's a really important point. And I think that part of why that is because we're in an inflationary environment where people are feeling the pinch on their pocketbooks, and people are caring more about electricity because it doesn't turn on automatically the way that it used to. It's not what it used to be. And so I think people are paying more attention.
And also now they're hearing about climate change. They're hearing about all these cool new technologies that they could get, or, new ways to manage their power and interacting with the grid and sending power back to the grid. I mean, all of this stuff is just cascading down on the public for the very first time.
That's right. And people want choice and independence and freedom. That's really important, is that you can figure out for yourself what kind of system you want. And then maybe what else I would point to is that I think we can further improve the focus of our investments here, where as an institutional venue, we talk a lot about kind of a lot of different things, load growth, IRA implementation, permitting reform. But if you really think about it as an institutional venue, I think PUCs are perhaps the most important venue to engage. And we need to direct more of the investment that's going in this broad ecosystem to these issues, because a lot of groups are, in some sense, doing the Lord's work, operating with low budgets, low staff, including the consumer advocates. Sometimes there may be only one. Sometimes the state might not have any consumer advocates. And so we need to direct that investment.
And like maybe green groups could just like dial back on the blue sky, here's my grand policy plan to decarbonize in 10 years, and like divert some of that energy and attention and time and money to the block and tackle of doing stuff, doing actual stuff now rather than big schemes.
And blocking and tackling is an apt analogy here, because I do think that commissions are like the offensive linemen, where, when things work, you don't know what they are, and when they don't. But let me add a last point here in terms of why I think that the times have changed. There is a realignment of things happening and of new coalitions that are forming, and there is strong bipartisan and nonpartisan engagement and support around these issues. Like, one example that I would really call out, that I think is important to call out, is in Louisiana, where that's a 5-person commission, and you have 2 commissioners representing different parties, Devontae Lewis and Craig Green, who have essentially worked together and come together to get energy efficiency rules advanced in the state for the first time in over a decade, nearly a decade and a half. And they've been able to do that despite a lot of opposition, concern, in part because this stuff isn't, fundamentally partisan. Energy efficiency is common sense.
We have sort of reached a point where, in many cases, utilities are just working for utilities now. You know what I mean? It's not like they have huge constituencies on their side anymore, even. Like, a lot of them are just really kind of out for themselves. There's not, insofar as the public engages, it's pretty obvious that the public is on the other side.
Yes. And just one other point that I would make on this is that the interests of all these different stakeholders are kind of coalescing in a way because of these affordability and reliability challenges and the increased strain on the grid. There's been obviously a lot of interest in things like virtual power plants, demand response, grid enhancing technologies. I kind of see them as sort of ibuprofen, where they don't solve all of our problems, but they do provide immediate relief that we can leverage to enable more fundamental reforms. And so what I mean by that is, obviously, and this is to your earlier point, utilities have an incentive to spend big.
Yeah.
But that doesn't exist anymore when people really are hurting in terms of energy bills, and you can't just default to this old, approach of just spending big. Of course, they're still doing that, but we need to change the mindset of all the folks in the space, because the more utilities invest in sort of default to their old school big investments, that crowds out the investments that are actually fundamentally necessary, including things like grid modernization and, just building out new infrastructure and, super sexy things like vegetation management.
Yeah, which is, just to make a note, like vegetation management is a classic example here. That's an operational cost
Yes.
for the utilities. So they do not get a rate of return on that, right? They only get a rate of return on their big investments in infrastructure. So all of these things that they could be doing to sort of maintain efficiency and maintain good performance, they don't get compensated for any of that. From their perspective, all of that is pure cost, right? I read this history of PG&E in California, and it's just over and over again. They sort of like get religion.
Yeah.
They're like, this time we care. We really get it. We're not going to do it again. But just like over time, the incentive structure, will win in the end. And like, if you don't get compensated for one thing and you do get compensated for something else, over time, you're going to stop doing the one thing and do the other thing.
Yeah, look, bottom line is this. We don't have the luxury to waste our resources on the expensive traditional stuff because of all these dynamics. We need to invest in these common sense, operational efficiency improving solutions. And if we want a healthy system, we can't just eat that ice cream of, building new expensive plants. We need to take our ibuprofen and eat our veggies and
Trim our
really
veggies.
invest. Yes. Eat our carrots, all those things.
So let's talk a little bit about policy. I mean, I know that you probably want to play your cards a little close to your vest about this kind of specific things that PowerLines might get involved in, specific policy battles or personnel battles or whatever else. But just maybe give us a sense of like high-level principles, like the kinds of policies that you want to get behind and push and the kind of reforms you have in mind.
When we think about what a modernized utility regulatory system means or looks like, I think it's three things. It's smarter planning, it's better incentives, and it's greater consumer protection. So what does that really mean? So, on the first point, smarter planning, I would call out that we need to take a serious look at the way that we do integrated resource planning in this country.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that utilities do every, like 2 years or 5 years? It's basically just like, what do we have and what are we going to need in the next 5 years, basically?
Yes, the horizons are usually 15 to 20 or 30 years, and they have to do it every 2 to 3 years. But, it's important to call out that it differs by state, and actually in almost half the states, there is no IRP process. And in that other, 30 states that have IRPs or so, not all of them, again, actually require their PUCs to formally approve or deny the authority. So you may see a scenario where a utility spends a ton of its time, its capacity, its resources to develop this plan only for the utility regulator to not actually be able to formally revise or approve or reject. They quote unquote acknowledge the IRP. That's sort of the term that
helpful
that we use. So we need to change this process. There's many ways to do it. Just to kind of paint a picture, give the PUC authority to approve or reject the IRP, and make sure that the utilities are first and foremost looking at how we can consider things like energy efficiency, demand response, virtual power plants, grid enhancing technologies. Resilience, exactly. It should be also aligned, again, with the Commission's authority around decarbonization and equity. So the utility has to look at, the impacts of their plans on environmental justice communities. And it should be aligned with other planning processes. Like states now have all sorts of different planning processes, things like grid modernization plans or integrated distribution system plans. And these often aren't coordinated.
Even the transportation system is coming to overlap with the energy system in a lot of intriguing and interesting ways. And like sooner or later, there's going to have to be some process that grapples with both of them at the same time.
Yes, that's right. Just thinking about EVs and what that means for the grid. So IRPs matter. And in fact, just over the next kind of 2 or so years, there's a ton of utilities with IRPs coming up. Georgia Power, Duke, Dominion, Arizona Public Service, Entergy. There's a bunch of others. And RMI has a great tool that tracks these different IRP docket opportunities. But just those 5, utilities that I mentioned, they account for over 20 to 30,000 megawatts of proposed gas build out. That's the first. I'll kind of quickly touch on the others because we're certainly happy to talk with anybody who's interested in these topics further. But in terms of better incentives, there are things that we can do to redesign rate structures where we can better, incentivize electrification, because right now electricity rates are artificially high compared to gas rates in many states. The current rate system isn't dynamic or smart. It doesn't actually reflect the marginal cost of generating electricity because people pay flat rates that don't vary with the time of use. So there's no real price signal in terms of the impacts on peak demand.
Geographic variation too. I mean, we'd like to be moving to a world where prices are in some sense time and geography specific.
Absolutely. And the last thing that I'll say on this is that there are incentive misalignment pieces in our rates such that utilities receive cost recovery for all their operating expenses, as you pointed out earlier. That includes things like fuel costs, like natural gas costs. And in an era where there is a lot of price volatility and utilities can sort of just pass those along to ratepayers, that's not sustainable, where, there are these reports showing that volatile gas prices are actually one of the biggest contributors to the rise in electricity rates. And so we need to be mindful of that. So the last thing is greater consumer protection. I think this is fairly kind of intuitive, although in practice, we have a long way to go, where there's things like, looking at the shutoff policies of utilities and when a customer can be shut off,
Right, the PPPs, is that what they're called?
Oh, you're talking about the PIPs, the percentage payment plans?
No, in California, when they preemptively shut off your power because they're worried about fire damage. There's some acronym there.
Yes.
And lots of people basically found out I have an hour of power left and they're going to shut off my power. There was not a lot of, not a lot of dialogue in that process.
Yeah. So, the policy that we would recommend here is intervener compensation, where only about a half dozen states have these programs, even though almost a dozen and a half have authorized these programs. And, this is pretty straightforward. It's giving groups, particularly representing the public interest, funding to formally intervene in PUC proceedings to cover legal expenses.
Just in case people don't get the thrust of this, doing the research and the work to gather information and compile it and make a strong legal argument that's legally, rigorous is just a time and money intensive. It takes a lot of time and money to do that. Utilities have that time and money. Your average environmental justice group does not.
Yeah, and to that point, whose time and money is the utility? It's the ratepayers, because they're using ratepayer funds to hire consultants and attorneys for the rate cases. So it makes obvious sense that we should be giving those groups representing the public interest the similar opportunity to access funds to intervene. And some states like California that have robust programs have actually found there to be a 14-to-1 return on investment for ratepayers with their program.
All right, so that's better planning, realigned incentives, better ratepayer protections. You actually left off a number 4 that's on your PDF, which is one of my favorites, which is about accountability, right? This is another process question. We need PUC commissioners to be more beholden to the public they serve.
Yes, that's right.
And for there to be some restraints on the revolving door by which people go back and forth from PUCs to utilities to legislatures. One of the first things Marissa Gillette did in Connecticut when she came in was just to say to PUC staff, no, you can't just spontaneously go out to dinner with utility executives. No, of course you can't do that. You have to make a record of it. It has to be logged as a lobbying session, just fuzzy edge cases like that. Just you need to establish some distance, it seems between PCs and utilities.
Yes, that's right.
So we've been through sort of how to think about PUC reform. We've been through kind of your policy priorities, policy principles by which you'd like to see them reform. So let's just talk a little bit about the group, the mechanics. What is PowerLines exactly, and what do you envision doing?
The $1 million question. So PowerLines is a new nonprofit organization, as you said. Our mission is to modernize the utility regulatory system to accelerate affordable, reliable, and clean energy for Americans. And we started it because of this urgent need to modernize utility regulation right now. Our regulatory system is aging even faster than our infrastructure. And so PowerLines, we're planning to serve as a hub to bring together important and credible stakeholders through that big tent coalition approach to share ideas and resources and to collectively work together on a path forward to better functioning PUCs. And so we're going to be doing really rigorous analysis to understand what's working in different states, to develop resources for different stakeholders to use to increase the visibility and awareness of these issues to the broader public. So we're going to figure out what needs to happen where and how do we get there.
So for instance, like if I wanted to know, like, who are my PUC people and when are they appointed or when are they up for election again? You're going to have sort of like, I'm just picking an example. You'll have a database where people can figure out their own state's situations.
That's right. It's on our website. And across those three dimensions, people, policy, process that we talked about, we're planning on engaging in all three. So, for something like, PUC elections, we've developed this data analysis to figure out what the down ballot drop off or what percentage of people are just not voting in these elections, even if they're voting, period. And it's about 8%. It's almost 1 in 10 Americans are voting for the president, but not their PUC commissioner in those states. So just raising awareness matters, especially when the margins can be really tight.
Yeah.
On the policy front, what we're trying to do is we've identified a set of policies that we think every state should consider adopting, and we've mapped out which states have which of these policies. But there's more work that needs to be done to actually figure out, what the pathway to actually get certain policies enacted looks like.
I mean, I bet there are state legislators listening to this as we speak saying, this all sounds great. I'd love to do something. What is that?
Yeah, and to them, I'd say reach out and we'd love to have a discussion on what specific policies that your state in particular can be proactively advancing. And, we've certainly mapped out some of that. But in terms of the last pillar, it's really supporting groups representing the public interest and intervening in these proceedings or just providing public testimony and then figuring out what the resource gaps are and trying to fill them and supply tools and resources. And
so you can imagine like supporting an intervener. You can imagine involving yourself in rate cases.
Probably less the latter, more the former. There are groups that are doing this work, as we pointed out. What's missing is a group that's sort of taking a step back, looking at this issue structurally and from a systems perspective and figuring out where are the gaps, what's missing here.
Right. I mean, I do think that we've said over and over again that not enough people are engaged or aware of all this. But I think another problem is that even there are a lot of people who are kind of vaguely aware that this whole thing is a problem, but I just don't think anybody knows what to do. I don't think anybody knows how to wrap their heads around it or how to approach it. So just like organizing the efforts of people who are already willing seems like a big piece of the puzzle here.
Exactly. And so I think you can picture PowerLines as playing this sort of role where we're figuring out what are the good ideas and actions and best practices in different states and figuring out how we can spread them at scale.
Is this going to be the kind of thing where, I know, companies can get involved, groups, intervener groups, environmental justice groups, renewable energy companies? What about just ordinary folk? Would this, if I'm just an ordinary person who wants to do something about climate change, would you point me in this direction? And if so, what would I do to help you?
There absolutely is space for more members of the public to engage, but we also want to be sophisticated about that where, if for instance, everybody has different motivations. If your motivation is climate, there's an important analysis of, just how much that message sticks in a certain state versus others. And so there are different messages and tools and approaches that I think need to be tried, and there's an opportunity to have a wider range of the spectrum of voices that have a material stake in these issues to have their voices, represented. I would say in particular, just on this point, the voices of low-income and environmental justice communities, I think, can be further amplified at these really wonky, arcane bodies.
For sure. And I'm guessing that ordinary people could also just donate to PowerLines if they want to. Are you going to be raising money from the public? Is this going to be are you going to focus on big donors, or do you have a strategy for that yet?
Well,
the fun part, raising money.
I should clarify my previous statement and say that is the $1 million question. And yes, the answer is yes. Like, we certainly, if folks feel inclined to, we certainly welcome and very grateful for any individuals that want to support PowerLines either financially or otherwise, and also other funders, particularly philanthropies and or other institutional funders. We certainly would love to have a conversation about why matter and what we can do about them.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, insofar as anybody gives a crap what I say, just like, to me, this is like, this idea is so long coming. Like I have been sort of wanting someone to do something like this for like a decade now. So this really seems to me like, I can't believe it doesn't already exist. And I'm very glad it exists now. And if left funders, I just hope they get a clue on this, because this is one of those areas where just a little bit of money and effort and time, I think, could have such rich payback, because as you say, there's virtually nothing going on here. So there's fruit lying on the ground right now because nobody's picking it up. So to kind of wrap up, I'm curious, maybe I should have started with this, but I'm curious just by way of going out. I've been immersed in this stuff long enough now that I've long since lost touch with ordinary people who have lives and don't swim in this stuff. And I'm just curious, like, have you done or do you plan to do anything like big polls or surveys or like, specifically like surveys of state legislators or even surveys of PUC commissioners themselves, just to get more information about what people know and don't know and want and don't want? Like, how good of a sense of the opinion landscape do you feel like you have? I mean, you have been, in the course of standing up this group and researching this group, you have been talking to a lot of people from a lot of different, parts of our world. So I'm just curious, like, what do people know? How much of a blank slate are we starting with here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and you're right. Through the course of starting this, we've probably had conversations with over 500 folks
Good
just
Lord.
on these different things, because it is really nuanced. It's complex, and there's no black and white narrative like, PUCs are bad,
evil oil companies
are good, et cetera. Yes, exactly. So it's very nuanced, but maybe, let me just say, I think that's important. We do plan to do that. I think that the literacy around utilities is, anecdotally speaking, not so great. I think a lot of people probably aren't even aware of the fact that their utility company is an investor-owned utility with shareholders on Wall Street. I don't think many people know that. So we do plan to also embark in these kind of listening tours and other sort of ways to just understand how people are reacting to and thinking about these bodies. And let me just say this, in terms of how I personally got motivated around this topic. It's not, what I would have expected to be focused on utility regulation. Again, it's not inherently sexy, but my kind of personal entree into this space was I actually first heard about public service commissions when I was 16, when we were trying to get solar panels on our school's roof, and we faced opposition from both our school district, who didn't think that, we were serious, we didn't have the funds, we didn't, the roof needed to be replaced, as well as the utility, which, didn't want a bunch of kids kind of trying to connect a distributed energy resource onto the grid. And in the process of engaging with the community, we did, get some feedback at that age, which is, don't trust the PSC, they're a rubber stamp. And that was my first exposure. I didn't know what that meant at all back then, but it certainly planted the seeds for my interest in this topic many years later when I was working with Jackie Patterson on this analysis to look at the diversity of PUC commissioners and the impacts on all these issues that we're talking about. And we found a pretty stark disparity. And, I kept on coming back to this notion that, people, not only do they, not pay attention to these issues as much as I would like, or there's low kind of, again, interest or prestige in this institution, but there's also, even among the informed folks, there's this sort of bearishness about the possibilities that lie ahead. And I think it's understandable, because this is a really, really tough nut to crack. And I do want to call out the fact that, this isn't going to be an overnight process where tomorrow suddenly everything's going to work great. That's not how it works, as you know.
A lot of these cozy relationships between PUCs and utilities have been developing for decades. You know what I mean? Like these people's parents served together on these boards. Like these are cozy systems that go way back. So like cracking them open a little bit, I think is going to be substantial work.
That's right. And I think, again, it in part starts with us talking about it. So really appreciate you offering up your platform to be able to continuously engage on these topics and to raise our collective literacy and awareness around these issues. And it's, again, important because, in my view, there is no single institution or venue that matters more to whether, as a society, as a country, we can deliver on an affordable, reliable, and clean energy transition over the next 3 to 5 years than PUCs and the decisions that they make over how all of this unfolds. And, whether your favorite issue is virtual power plants or load growth or permitting reform or electrification, all of this intersects with the PUC and IRA implementation and transmission build out and interconnection queues and AI growth and this notion of build. All of this is going to come down to the decisions that these PUCs make. And it's not going to be easy, but we can win. And we need to increase our awareness and investment in these issues because it'll take that for us to actually be able to deliver on these results.
And, you don't even necessarily need to transform the thing overnight. Just like marginal changes in any of this would be enormously helpful. Like it is truly surreal. I mean, I know we've hit this point several times now, but by returning to it, it is bizarre that like we complain about, electrification, how slow it is. We complain about natural gas. We complain about blackouts and shutoffs. Like we complain about utilities fighting this and that. Like we complain about all these things. And like there is literally an instrument of the public will already set up with its hands on all this stuff. And we're just not using them. We're not paying attention to them. It's truly, truly bizarre. So I just would reiterate again, like it's long overdue. Anyone interested in climate change, pollution, clean energy, economic competitiveness, international competitiveness, jobs, name it, has got to engage in the fact that we have public bodies that regulate all that stuff that are mostly ignored and often corrupt, very often under-resourced and underappreciated. I just don't think it would take that much to pretty dramatically improve that situation.
Well, we'll see.
I guess you're going to find out. Charles, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for being the one person who saw this problem and actually decided to do something about it. Thanks for walking us through it. And I'll just reiterate again to the audience, love this. This is long overdue. If you perchance are sitting on top of a family fortune or something like that, this effort needs wings. So pay attention.
So for the listeners interested in any of this work, we'd love to hear from you and connect. We're interested in engaging with a wide range of stakeholders, including PUC commissioners, state legislators, federal policymakers, community and public interest groups, companies, cities, towns, academic institutions, students, or anyone generally interested in these topics. You can find more information about PowerLines on our website, which is powerlines.org, or reach out to us at contact@powerlines.org.
All right. Thanks again, Charles.
Thanks so much, David. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes my guests and I sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.